In this video, you'll learn how the Ask Amplitude functionality, which is Amplitude's AI, works, and why this might just be the future of your data. Now, we're going to look at this video in 3 sections. First, we're going to look at what this Ask Amplitude looks like. Then we're going to go behind the scenes to understand what is going on. And third, we're going to look at how to roll this out. That being said, let's jump right in. We're going to start by looking at my screen here. So we have the Amplitude interface. This is the new interface, of course. Now, anywhere where you have the left-hand menu, you can actually open that, then go into Ask Amplitude here, and you're going to end up at this screen. So we have a very familiar sort of ChatGPT interface. This is actually using OpenAI in the background, so this is really ChatGPT through an API, of course. Now in here, we have the ability to simply ask questions to build charts using natural language, right? Now, I've been using Amplitude for 10 years, so I'm very familiar with the interface. I kind of understand how almost everything works. There's some advanced formulas and things like that perhaps I have never used myself. But for me, building the chart tends to be pretty quick. But for a lot of people, and I train a lot of people on how to use Amplitude, there's a friction in trying to get individuals to actually understand the product. So something like a natural language interface might be actually very helpful. But let's see how it actually works. So let's start by typing one query here. Now, the data here is the demo data Amplitude offers. In particular, we're looking at the e-commerce data, which is meant to mimic what something like a Walmart or perhaps a Shopify store might have. So you can imagine that some of the events in this data set are things like purchases, add to cart. There's probably something around like viewing products. And of course, the event properties will be built around those events in some kind of logical form. So let's start with something simple. Let's say, how many purchases do we have in the last month? So just like ChatGPT, we enter some kind of question query, and then it comes back, in this case, with a chart. Now, it can do other things, but we're going to start with charts first. And right away, we get a chart here built. We can see it's sort of measuring the total number of times, which means it's the total events. It's taking some event called complete purchase. That makes sense. All users, breaking it daily between the last 30 days, effectively last month, right? I'm recording this video on December 2nd, 2024. So far pretty good, Now this might take perhaps the same amount of time to build it manually inside the Amplitude interface. If you know the interface, this may not seem so cool, but someone who doesn't actually know the interface, they kind of build the same thing very quickly. Now, just like ChatGPT, we actually need to iterate on this query to really make the most out of it. Now, we know that this data set actually has more than one purchase event. Let's look at that briefly. So if we go to the actual segmentation chart here, and we look at the drop-down events, we can see actually that there's complete purchase, the one the sort of ChatGPT query used. But there's another one called purchase subscription, and we might actually care about this too. And perhaps when we talk about purchases, we actually care about both. So we'll make a detail to add that. Just so you see some of the events, right? There's 46 events here that are not these sort of the Amplitude ones. But just so you get a quick glance of them, right? Things you might expect, right? Shipping info, there's some checkout events, some other like contact events, favorite items, logins, trials, right? Some view events that I talked before. And then there's some Shopify kind of specific things. Okay. So pretty standard or e-commerce events, right? And luckily for us, they're actually named logically, so we don't have to guess what they are. But let's go back to our query. So let's make a tweak here, and let's add the subscription purchase event, and I mistyped subscription. I don't think it'll matter to this, but we're going to change it nonetheless to the chart. Okay, so it takes the query. Now, we'll see this in the next section, but this is actually going to an OpenAI server and then coming back. So there's a bit of a lag. It might be just a few seconds, but it's really more about just managing your expectations more than perhaps an issue. We tend to find like when I use ChatGPT, there might be a bit of a lag while it kind of process the query dependent on the complexity of the query. So it may not be an actual issue, but just something to be aware of. Now, once again, we have the same chart here, but it added the second event, the purchase subscription event, which makes sense. You know what, though? I think I want to combine them. So let's try that. Let's combine both events into a single custom event. Now, something you might notice is, of course, I'm using the Amplitude language, right? So I'm talking about events. I'm talking about custom events, which is another sort of functionality in the Amplitude product. And we'll see what this is, I think, kind of important when working with this. But nonetheless, now we have the combined purchases last month. Pretty good. Now we get some suggestions here, right? Some follow-ups where it's saying, perhaps you want to segment on this specific property, this A/B test purchase. Maybe you want to filter on the quantity event property or do another segmentation. Let's see, let's kind of segment it by country. Mostly because we know that we're going to have this country data. So now it modifies the chart, and of course, it kind of gives us the country breakdown, the US being number one, and then the sample data for other countries and so on. And this kind of makes sense. The segmentation chart typically only shows a certain number of countries. There might be 10, 20, 30 other ones. Now, something to be noted here is that anytime you can actually click the title or click this open chart, and you're taken to the chart itself, you can see that it created a custom event called purchase, event totals, is doing the segmentation by country. It's interesting that it's actually doing the segmentation here instead of doing a group by. Okay, that makes sense. Both work, but just some slight differences. So this is the chart itself has created. Okay, so good so far. Now, something else that I find kind of interesting is it can actually do takeaways from the chart. So this is a follow-up here. So let's choose it. Now it's gonna ask us if we want to allow OpenAI server to actually read the data, right? So we're gonna confirm that this is the case. Again, we're gonna see this more in a second when we go into the documentation. We're gonna allow it. So it's going to take the chart data in some form, maybe a JSON form or of some kind, maybe a CSV, gives it to the API, and it comes back and it gives it some takeaways, right? It tells you that the US had the highest numbers of purchases, followed by the UK and Germany, and so forth. Takeaways are okay, but the chart itself is also quite basic. I'm sure depending on the chart itself, you might get some more interesting takeaways. But the point to be made here is that you can start to have a bigger conversation. So you have the first level of creating charts and then modifying those charts, filtering them. That's kind of cool. Then you can start to maybe create some summaries. Let's call them maybe level 2. And then you can start to perhaps think about strategy, right? You talk about another follow-up here is telling us to perhaps how we can use this data to optimize our marketing strategy. And it kind of gives us some ideas based on this. Now, all of this, like with ChatGPT, really varies on what kind of questions you're asking, how complex is the issue in particular, what's your level of expertise. So you might see this, you might think this is super basic, not really worth it. But yeah, remember, this is some kind of natural language conversation. So, I mean, there's a lot of different possibilities of what could be actually asked here and in response. And I'm sure, like in ChatGPT, the more specific, the more granular, and the more expertise you might have in a specific area, the more valuable something like this might be. What I find really cool here, though, is that the ability to create charts is, in my opinion, relatively strong, right? It won't happen on the first query. It will take some modifications. But if you know the data and you know the building blocks, you can actually build charts pretty quickly here, especially if you don't know the interface, which I think this is what the primary use case is of this functionality. Let's do something a little bit more complex. Let's actually create a funnel. So let's tell it this to create a funnel of all the steps a user must take to complete a purchase. So we saw a few, right, in the previous window. We know there's something about shipping and add to carts and so on. So let's see what it does here with the events itself. Okay, so it took some kind of main landing, some kind of landing page of some kind. It searched for items. Now, right away, we're assuming the user is searching for items. Of course, they might not search for items. They might just click something from the landing page itself, but nonetheless, keep that in mind. It viewed the item details. Okay, that makes sense. Then it added to cart and it complete the purchase. Okay, makes sense. Now we don't have subscriptions here. So perhaps let's also create another funnel for the subscription checkout. Let's try that. We know we have this subscription event that's equivalent to the complete purchase. So let's see what it does here. Okay, so this seems okay, right? Add subscription payment info, purchase description. I actually did see some events there around trials, which I think might make sense in this funnel here. Perhaps you start the trial and then you add the subscription payment and then you purchase it. Hard to say, right? So we start to see how, at the first glance, it's okay, but perhaps we need to tweak it and add any other missing events that might be here. Now, one of the downsides I see right away is if you're not familiar with the building blocks, if you don't know what data is actually being tracked, then this back and forth might be quite difficult, because you might see, for example, the first funnel here, and this might seem okay to you, but we know there's some events around shipping. There might be events around payment information, like adding like a credit card. And these events might be helpful in your funnel, right? So perhaps we need to understand those building blocks. Maybe we can ask Amplitude itself, do we have any events around shipping and credit cards? Okay. So we have the shipping info, we have the checkout. All right. So there might be some digging here that we may need to ask if you're not too familiar with the data, which is perhaps the biggest limitation. If you don't know what's available, then how do you know that you're actually getting the exact chart? So it's not really an issue of do you know the Amplitude interface or not, is do you know the building blocks? And we'll see this in section 3 when we look at sort of what's needed to get this to roll out. Otherwise, pretty cool. As an alternative to using the interface, I think it's good, right? We have to ask the right questions. We need to know the right building blocks. We need to expect that there's going to be some back and forth, but we can see we're kind of getting charts, right? And from there, we can start to build it out. And my sense is once you know this, once you become more familiar with the Amplitude data and the Amplitude language, then, the single query can contain everything. We can say, hey, show me the last purchases for the last 30 days. Make sure to increase subscriptions as one single event. Let's also segment by country. And let's also segment by city. And let's also segment by UTM source, last touch. Boom. And then, it will take everything and likely give you the right chart, or at least something that's very close that might just take maybe one more modification. So this is the natural language uses. I think it's really cool overall. I have seen Amplitude and Mixpanel and the other tools in this industry sort of add some of the machine learning stuff over the years. And I think it's been helpful in some ways. They tend to cover a very specific analysis type. For example, somewhat like the Mixpanel signal or the Amplitude equivalent, where it's a very specific use case where machine learning is used. But something like this, which is much more broad, much more general, I think can be a great way to get non-technical users, people who are not familiar with Amplitude, to actually start playing with the data, start building their own charts, destroying them and tweaking them and modifying them and everything else, because they don't need to know the interface. They just need to know how to ask questions, and perhaps they might have a couple things to help them, like the building blocks themselves. So I'm excited to see how this actually progresses, how it gets used by different people, different individuals, and how this might make data more accessible for individuals. So I really think this kind of interface will become a significant portion for all these tools in the future, and it will really be a big part of the future for tools like Amplitude and Mixpanel and everything else. Just a natural way to engage with the data. Now, that being said, cool demo, looks cool, like lots of potential, lots of things to keep in mind. There's some downsides, some negatives, but overall, I think it's a solid addition to the Amplitude product. Let's go behind the scenes a little bit to understand what's going on from an API perspective, an integration perspective, and of course, a privacy perspective. So we're here in the documentation that Amplitude offers for Ask Amplitude. It's a bit short, but it does give us some answers to what's going on behind the scenes. So we're gonna go down here. So we know this is using OpenAI. So it's using ChatGPT, at least, a similar API to ChatGPT. So we're saying here that this actually sends a request to OpenAI, and then OpenAI decides either to create a chart versus doing some kind of search, versus doing some kind of summary. So it's kind of doing all that and then giving the response back. So here's some of the data that may be sent to OpenAI, right? We have the chart definition metadata, for example, the event properties and metrics and so on, the taxonomy information like names, descriptions, names of dashboards, projects, aggregate results and charts. So this is where we start to get some interesting privacy information, right? So Amplitude will say that they're going to send a conversation thread that we were just looking at, but OpenAI doesn't receive your customer data, and it won't store or train on any of this data. So I guess, Amplitude might have some special deal with OpenAI so this doesn't happen. And we did see that special prompt for the takeaways, right, where Amplitude does ask for some of the customer data. So I do think there's a possibility here. I mean, I think it's just the way it's been built, that the way it's been designed is there's some almost like a blind interaction here between Amplitude and OpenAI, where OpenAI can see some of the event names, perhaps, complete purchase, complete subscription, whatever it was. It doesn't seem like it needs to share a specific PII in particular, so anything like emails and first names. Nonetheless, if your organization has high privacy requirements, you likely want to double check exactly what's being shared and what's not being shared, since this does introduce a third-party server like OpenAI, and then there is some sensitivity right now around what OpenAI does with the data. Now it says there's no storing or training, but double checking if your organization cares about those things in particular. Let's keep going down here and see what else we have in the documentation that might be helpful. Something that stood out to me is that it seems like Amplitude is making a record of not just your taxonomy, the events and properties, but it's actually making a record at popular saved charts. That is charts that seem to have lots of views. It's looking at perhaps popular events by event volume. It's looking at different event properties and which ones have more data. For example, it's saying like if you have duplicate event properties, they say 2 for user ID, it will take the one that seems to have the most data. And it seems to learn all this, and eventually it seems to get better over time. So it seems like, again, Amplitude is making some behind the scenes before it ever kind of interacts with OpenAI around your account and what seems to be the most popular way to think about your accounts. So it may mean that if you have users who don't use this, but are creating charts, they are tweaking charts, they are sending those charts to people, that activity will eventually play a role in these queries as just another signal for what data should be used. Okay, so it's, again, what's being sent to OpenAI. So it's looking at from property values in particular. There's something to do with filters. So in this case, depending on your question, a filter might be sent. The suggestions tend to look at some of the event properties as well. And of course, kind of chat history as well. So again, it depends on scenarios, not 100% obvious what data might be sent to OpenAI. But again, just to keep in mind that there might be some data back and forth. Now, again, just a confirmation that there's no storing or training. Again, this kind of gets us into section 3 ahead of time. Again, it's probably the best way to make this data useful is just simply to make your data clean. Now, this demo data was great because it's kind of obvious, right? We have a purchase, we have subscriptions, we have trials, we have checkout events, we have view events. All the data kind of makes sense. And it seems like the more logical the data is, then the more easier it would be to build charts, modify them, and so forth. So this, of course, has been the theme in this channel for years. The use of tracking plans when you implement data. Nonetheless, if that's not the case, we'll get to section 3 on what to do. But just again, the better structure your data, the more obvious the structure of data is, the easier these kind of tools will be. And I can imagine cases where I have seen data structures in the past that are just terrible. They make no sense. You need some kind of like special key to understand them. That is not really going to fly very well with some kind of natural language responses. But if your data makes sense, if it's logical, right? If you're an e-commerce site, you should have probably similar name events as what we saw before. If you're a SaaS product, like a B2B SaaS, your events, again, should be logical within your, your team. And the more you do that, then the easier it will be to do this. Clarifications that might be needed if your organization cares about privacy here for the OpenAI connection. But just so you know that there is some data sharing happening behind the scenes depending on what question is being asked. And in some particular, some prompts might happen like what we saw before. But just that's where the data is. This is not some kind of internal GPT that Amplitude built. It's being integrated with OpenAI. And it's pretty fast considering, we're going to some external server. But just to keep in mind, that's kind of what's happening behind the scenes. Section 3. So how do you roll this out to users? That's probably maybe the next question. And I think before we roll this out, as administrators, as people perhaps who are managing the Amplitude data, the first thing we have to do is we have to make sure that the data makes sense, right? Now, if your data does not make sense, you can re-implement, which is, of course, a lot of effort. It might be worth it depending on how chaotic your data might be. Or you can simply just rename it, right? Amplitude has the data taxonomy product where you can actually rename every event. I actually have another tutorial where I talk about this in I think it's the advanced Amplitude debugging tutorial, which I will link here, so you can see that if you like. I simply say that, hey, if you're not willing to re-implement all your data, fair enough, I get it. Then you have to go into the data taxonomy product and just rename the events, perhaps rename the event properties so they make more sense, so they are logical to anyone who has some level of familiarity with your product, right? So that's really the first step. We cannot have poor data, inaccurate data that doesn't make sense in a product like this. This has to be obvious as people engage with it, right? We didn't have to think, this is what purchase is or this is what subscription is. And we still have to modify charts, even when the data is obvious. So if your data is not obvious, the level of modification and tweaks that's needed is going to be very, very high. Number 2, I think it should be helpful to have some kind of cheat sheet that can be shared with individuals, like a PDF or maybe a piece of paper or a whiteboard, whatever your team uses. And I think in that cheat sheet, it's helpful to have sample questions you can ask so you can get started. But this is on top of the suggestions Amplitude might have. They might be more specific to your organization, so kind of users can get a sense for the data. And there might be some questions that are quite universal, right? Like, show me all the events we have in the platform, show me the 10 most popular event properties, show me the 10 most popular events, kind of stuff like that. I think would be helpful in the cheat sheet so someone can grab it and start kind of playing around with it. I also think it'd be helpful to talk about the building blocks. So what is, what are the event names? What are the event properties? Again, maybe not all the events, right? This account has something like 40 events, but what are like the 10 most popular events and what do they do? And what are like the 10 most popular event properties and what do they do? And once people see it, they can start to make assumptions of what the other 20, 30 events might look like once they see the sort of the naming convention that you're following for those top 10 events. And I think this taxonomy in particular, I just think it's helpful just for users to know what they're playing with, right? It's almost like if you're trying to make a recipe, but you have no idea what basil or olive oil or like sweet potatoes are, it's gonna be really difficult. So having some understanding as to what are the building blocks that you're playing with, in which in our case are the event properties, the events, perhaps the user properties if you want to use them. Those are kind of the things that we're playing with, and we want to know what they are, at least at some initial level that we're going to dive into. And number 3, I do think it's helpful to have in this cheat sheet Amplitude-specific language, right? So I'm familiar with Amplitude, so I know that, we have events, we have event properties. I know that if we're going to take 2 events, it's probably going to be a custom event. It could also be a formula if we wanted to. I know that the main report is called segmentation, or there's a report called funnels, or a report called retention, and so forth. So again, it's having some of these cues around the key Amplitude language items, I think will also make the interaction easier. You could probably maybe get away with it. You say, hey, create me a chart that's like a line chart or like a stack line chart. But even then, you have to know language around what charts are. So generally providing keywords that people can use and what they mean in this cheat sheet, I think would be really helpful. And third, we have to do some kind of training here, right? Training on at least on the basics, the taxonomy, in my opinion, the Amplitude language, and probably just some basic queries. So what I like the intent that you can just sort of take this tool and then roll it out to anyone without any training, any kind of documentation. I don't think that's actually true in most organizations. But I do think that the level of training needed here is significantly less than trying to train users on how to use segmentation, how to use funnels, how to use retention. I know that. I have run these trainings myself for years, so I know how long those trainings take. I know what it looks like to do in a group level, do it individual level. I think the training for something like this will be much less time and could actually probably all be, some kind of self-serve content like short videos, a PDF, things like that, with perhaps some minimal group training, which I think is a big appeal here. They can kind of get up and running quicker. That being said, those are, I think, the things that are needed to roll out. Better data, some kind of cheat sheet with some handful of items, and some basic level of training, whether self-serve training or at least some maybe group level training to get users comfortable with this product. And that's all I have for this video. So I hope you enjoyed this. We looked at 3 things. What is the Ask Amplitude interface, the functionality, which I think is just fantastic. It needs some work from the users, but I think it's a big win for how to interact with the data and what the future of data might look like. We looked at a little bit of the privacy. There's not a lot in the documentation. We know it's going to go into OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT. So we can make some assumptions as to what's being sent. But if privacy is a high risk for your company, you really want to check this and make sure this is within your parameters of privacy considerations. And third, we looked at what would it take to roll this out to users. Again, keeping in mind that we need to have clean data, some kind of cheat sheet, and probably at least some basic level training. My name is Ruben Ugarte. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're looking for a next video to watch, I would actually recommend you actually watch my Amplitude tutorial. This is a core video I recorded a few months ago. It's about, I think, an hour long, and it looks at all the different things that are needed to get Amplitude implemented. I will double check this. Even if you've done an Amplitude implementation, it'd be helpful for you to make sure that you actually done all the steps correctly before you roll this out. Again, I think there's a lot of work to happen behind the scenes before something like this becomes really powerful. So check that out. If you haven't implemented Amplitude and you're kind of curious about this, ChatGPT integration and how it can make data easier, you still need to go through a bit of an implementation. So this video is a fantastic next point for your team. With that being said, my name is Ruben. We'll talk soon.